Here's the summary for, there we go, summary for chapter 22. I'm going to talk about inspiration and expiration. So inspiration, expiration, so basically breathing. And then I'm going to talk about that bicarbonate buffer system. Here we have inspiration. This is where gases are flowing into the lungs. And you have expiration where gases are exiting the lungs. Usually, what are you breathing in? Oxygen. And what are you breathing out? CO2, right? So this is a mechanical process that depends on volume changes in the thoracic cavity. So volume changes lead to pressure changes, and pressure changes lead to gas flow equalizing the pressure. If volume increases, pressure decreases. So we said in class, if this is your cavity, this is your thoracic cavity, and you've got molecules, gas molecules in here. If we drop the floor on this container and we now have a much larger cavity or container, what happens to the gas? You still have the same gas molecules, but they're now spread out more. So if your volume increases, your pressure decreases. So all of these gas molecules are bumping into each other and they are under high pressure. As soon as I make the cavity larger, as soon as I increase the volume of the cavity, now they're under less pressure because the molecules can move around freely. So it's the opposite if you decrease the volume. So what happens if I push this floor back up? I had all these gas molecules, and now I've pushed the floor up. I'm going to confine all those gas molecules in a much smaller space. So I've decreased the volume. What happens to the pressure inside? The pressure is going to increase. Okay, here's inspiration. I don't want you guys to follow all of this. I want you to write it on your own. You can use this as a guide, but if you write this pressure gradient until intrapulmonary pressure equals 0, I'm not going to give you full credit, because if I asked you to explain to me what this means, you're not going to be able to do it in most cases. So what do you need to start with? Start here. Number 1, diaphragm moves inferiorly during contraction. 2, ribs are going to flare. Sternum is going to flare, intercostals are going to contract. You're going from a volume in your thoracic cavity that looks like this, and you're going to a volume that looks like this. So you have increased the volume of your thoracic cavity. So number 3, tell me about the volume. When I do 1 and 2, what happens third? Tell me something about the increasing the volume of your thoracic cavity. Then number 4, if you increase the volume, what happens to pressure? So they're talking about air pressure inside this cavity. So if the volume increases, what happens to the air pressure? It decreases. So now inside the lungs, you have low air pressure. What's the next thing that's going to happen? Number 5. What's out here? Here's oxygen out in the air. This oxygen is higher, under higher pressure than what's inside your lungs. So where does air flow? From high to low. So say something about because the outside air is under higher pressure than the lungs, air flows in. Again, if you write these terms, I'm going to take off. So what is expiration? Well, we're just doing the opposite of everything. So we had this really large volume, right? We had increased volume. What are we going to do? We're going to snap the diaphragm back up. Diaphragm's going to relax. Your ribs and your sternum and your intercostal muscles are going to relax. So we have a large volume. We're now going to go back to our smaller volume, right? So now we have a decrease in the volume of the thoracic cavity. So thoracic cavity, decreased volume. With decreased volume, I'm going to have increased Pressure, air pressure. So right now, inside the lungs, the air is high. So why does air move out? So outside air, why does it move out? Because the pressure is lower outside compared to the air inside the lungs. So you should be able to write that in a summary. This could be one of your discussion questions on the test. Next concept that we need to understand is the transport of respiratory gases. I'm going to switch to green here. So we know oxygen is going to go into the cells, right? Because what are the cells going to do with oxygen? They're going to take it, combine it with glucose, and they're going to make carbon dioxide, water, and ATP. ATP is the real goal. These are kind of the byproducts, right? So we can see here, oxygen is going to go into this tissue, and what's going to come out? CO2. So we're going to talk about both of these and how they're transported in the blood. We'll start with easy first. If you want to say 1% and 99%, I'm fine with that. So how is oxygen transported? How is it carried in the blood? 1% is dissolved in the plasma. Think of it as gas bubbles, right? It's just dissolved in the plasma. 99% of it is bound to a red blood cell. We remember the hemoglobin, we remember the iron group, right? So each hemoglobin can transport 4 oxygen molecules. So here's the oxygen being dropped off at the cells. How is it carried? 1% dissolved in the plasma, 99% it's bound to a red blood cell, specifically the hemoglobin. Now we get to look at the CO2. How do we transport CO2? 10% is dissolved in plasma, 20% is bound to hemoglobin, and 70% of it, we're going to do this complex reaction called bicarbonate buffer system. So this is probably new for us. We probably would have said the majority of our CO2 is bound to hemoglobin. That's not true. It's only about 20%. So this is the part that we're going to focus on. This image, you see CO2 dissolved in plasma. We said this was 10%. Then we said CO2 bound to hemoglobin. This was 20%. Now the rest of it goes through this complex reaction. So these two make up the 70%. So carbon dioxide and water, these are the wastes from cellular respiration, right? So the tissue is giving off these two items and it's traveling in your blood. When water and carbon dioxide come together, they can form carbonic acid. And then carbonic acid can be broken down into hydrogen and bicarbonate ions. These are the items that are floating in your blood. What we're trying to do is keep our pH of our blood between 7.35 and 7.45. By having these ions free floating in our blood, we can keep our blood within this specific range. So if I dumped a whole bunch of acid into my bloodstream, the bicarbonate is going to buffer it. So your blood will not drop below 7.35. If I put in a bunch of bicarbonate into my bloodstream, like through the pancreas, then the bicarbonate or the alkaline material is going to bind the hydrogen and you won't have your blood pH go above 7.45. So why do we do 70% of all of our carbon dioxide transport? Why is 70% broken down into hydrogen and bicarbonate ions? We're doing this so that we can maintain our blood pH between 7.35 and 7.45. Here's the same image again. This is the 70%, right? We take the water and the carbon dioxide, we form carbonic acid, and then we break it down to bicarbonate and hydrogens. There are two pathways here. You can see that there's a slow and a fast pathway. We're just going to lump them all together. So you don't have to worry about the fact that it's going through the red blood cell or whether it's in the plasma. Okay, This is a different slide. Here we're at the lungs. Before we were at the tissue. So we went tissue releases CO2 and water. Then it turns into carbonic acid. And then it breaks down into bicarbonate and hydrogen ions. And we said this is keeping our blood pH between 7.35 and 7.45. It's acting as a buffer. But what happens once we get to the lungs? So now we see we're at alveolus. What can we do? How do we get rid of the CO2? The whole point of transporting this CO2 is eventually to get rid of it. So now we do the reverse. You can see here that the hydrogen and the bicarbonate come together, they form carbonic acid, then they break down into CO2 and water, and this is the CO2 that you exhale. So basically you just do this entire reaction in reverse when you get to the lungs so that you can get rid of the CO2 that you were transporting. If I asked you a question on the exam, explain how carbon dioxide is transported and exchanged in the systemic, that's tissue level, and explain also the pulmonary, this is at the lung level, and explain the equation, and I listed this equation. So could you explain how CO2 is transported and exchanged in the systemic and pulmonary capillaries, explaining this, using this equation to explain. So step one, tell me the 10%, the 20%, and then this equation is the 70%, right? That's the majority, how CO2 is transported. Then tell me in the tissues, so step two, go from tissue to blood, or you could say blood plasma. So tell me the tissues make CO2 and water, it gets turned into carbonic acid, which gets broken down into bicarbonate and hydrogen ions, and these guys are traveling in the blood plasma. Step three, tell me why. What are we hoping to do by having these two ions floating around in our bloodstream? We're trying to maintain what? Hopefully you're saying to yourself, maintaining pH between 7.35 and 7.45. Now, step four, I want you to tell me what happens once you get to the lungs. So what happens when you get to the lungs? Basically, write the equation backwards. You're going to take bicarbonate and hydrogen, you're going to form carbonic acid, you're going to break it down into water and carbon dioxide, and what are you going to do to the carbon dioxide? You're going to exhale.